everyone. Sorry I can't be with you in person, or at least virtually in person. I'm on my way to Australia. You're catching me in flight right now. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. I'm going to talk about healthy soil, something that, that's my jam. And if you have any questions for after the presentation, please, by all means, reach out to me on email, and I'd be happy to try and answer any of the questions that you actually have. And, we're going to get right into it. Okay, so I really like the slide. This is from Groundswell, and I love my soil, and no earthworms are left overnight in this van. This is all, it really is about taking that time to really focus on your soils. And we're going to really focus hard on soils today. We're going to start with the Gaia theory, though, because I think the most important thing is for everyone to remember that everything is connected. Everything we do is connected. Every practice that you use, every plant that you put in the ground, all of them are connected, and all of them have consequences and changes and all of these things, as we'll see later. So every different plant you put in the ground has its own rhizosphere root exudates, leaks its own signature of chemicals, and that drive that really define the microbial community around the roots. And so this is a perfect example of Gaia theory. I think this is a friend, Johanna Jaakkola in Finland, with her new son and her purebred Hereford cattle. And I think this is what it's really about, right? Generations. She farms with her father and her brother. And together they have one of the first regenerative high-density stock grazing operations in Finland. So Gaia tells us that all our actions have consequences, and they can be positive, negative, or really neutral, but they're cascading. So which means that you start something in motion and then it just stays in motion. And hopefully we want to keep everything going in a really good way, but occasionally things are going to go in a way that we might not like them, but that doesn't mean we can't reverse. And I think a really good example of something that we can reverse with soil health is that when soil erodes, for example, into the Great Lakes, into the ocean spaces, it's not about the nutrients in the water that's leaking in there. It's really the actual sediments. And the sediments carry a lot of nutrients that are bound. And they're the ones that cause most of the problems, not only because they cloud the waters, but also because they are carrying way more nutrients, and they're also carrying a lot of carbon with them as well. And that affects fisheries. In particular, like in the oceans, it affects shellfish. In freshwater, it affects fisheries as well. It affects our ability to have recreation because of blue-green algae blooms, and it affects the quality of our drinking water. And those are all things that if we just stop soil erosion, we could prevent all that. So it's one of those things where every action has consequences. And like I said, in this case, it's not a good one. But if we stop erosion, then it's a great one. Regenerative agriculture integrates the conventional with the alternative. It also integrates organic with traditional agriculture as well. So it's really in the middle. And that's what I love about regenerative agriculture. I think we don't know a lot about what regenerative agriculture is, but we know what it isn't. And I think that's okay. I had that conversation once with Dr. Temple Grandin, and she said, Jill, seems to me we don't know a lot about what regenerative agriculture is, but we certainly know what it isn't. And that's okay. And I think it is okay. I also believe that regenerative agriculture is this beautiful place where it's sort of like a free space where it's not a set of practices, like it's not defined practices. You do what's right for you. You do what gives you the right results, and you do what drives your soil health forward. So yeah, I think that's the place where we're at with regenerative agriculture. And soil health underpins all of that. Without soil health, there is no regenerative agriculture. There certainly is conventional agriculture, but there certainly is an organic agriculture, and we're really not going to grow any kind of decent quality food. And overall, we're seeing that our health declined. I mean, Dr. Mark Hyman said it himself. He said the quality of food is linked to the health and the functioning of our healthcare system. And I think that is correct. So, these are the kinds of things that we really want to focus in with this talk today. Okay. And sharing good food does create change. This is a group of farmers that I work with, Life Unlimited, and we were on a tour in Lleida, Spain. And we saw the difference in some of the farmers that we met with, where they were really just trying to get to the point where they can embrace no-till. And, a year later, they were all no-till farmers, and they had really diverse crops. And some of them were intercropping and cover cropping. It was really quite marvelous. So a lot of you have seen this before. Biology really drives the whole system. There is no soil health if the soil isn't alive. And the soil can only be alive if it's biologically active. Now, that soil biology can change the chemical availability of the soil. So it can change the way nutrients cycle in the soil. And it can also change the physical structure of the soil. But once again, these things are all connected. And then soil health is connected to soil productivity. What we grow, what the quality of what we grow is, whether or not we have environmental pollutants or some of our nutrients leaking into our environment. And we certainly don't want a leaky soil system. We want everything to stay in the soil. We want everything to go into food quality. We want everything to go into making that plant as healthy as it can be. And ultimately, when we do that, we have health and wellness for us and our animals, and our plants are thriving. But first, we need to figure out how we go about doing this. So first thing that we do, especially if we're thinking in the legacy, in the legacy framework or in the legacy lens, we need to conserve soil so that there's something to regenerate and sustain. And you can see the difference here in a potato field in Switzerland, where there's mulch, we're actually retaining the water. It's not pooling, we're holding on to it, it's leaking in. As Jimmy Emmons would say, how much water did you get? And you want to answer all of it. And in this case, I think on the mulch side, we've got most of it. Maybe not all of it, but most of it. Plant cover and leaving stubble stops erosion. I mean, you can see this was in North Dakota, -30, soil blowing. And you don't see, if you look at the side of the ditch, and these were just opposite sides of the road, you can see no soil in the ditch where we actually have stubble cover. So another important thing, if you're using reduced tillage, if you've got any kind of tillage, you want to have some cover on there so that you can prevent soil from eroding, because you're losing all the capability of having soil biological fertility when you blow off all that light stuff. Because what's blowing off? It's not the rocks, it's not the sand, it's the organic matter, it's the topsoil. And who can afford to lose that? We can use technology to our advantage too. A stripper header prevents erosion. It catches snow, and more importantly, in the early spring after we've seeded into it, it actually protects the seedlings from drying out. It gives them a little microclimate that they can actually grow and thrive in. So there's a lot of reasons. So take advantage of the new technologies too, if you can. Take advantage of everything that you can get in your toolbox. And healthy, well-structured pasture soils, I don't want to just focus on cropping. I want to focus on grazing as well. Healthy soils in a grazing situation, soils can be a lot healthier in a grazing situation, but not if they're overgrazed, not if we're not leaving enough cover on to prevent erosion, and not if we're grazing so much and we're keeping cattle in one place that we have a lot of erosion. So not erosion, but a lot of compaction. So one of the things to do is, you know, you want to be moving, using your stocking skill, your stockman skills, and be moving paddocks as often as you can. Create smaller paddocks, move them more frequently. Andre Voisin in the 1950s talked about the need for actually moving cattle more often, creating smaller paddocks, and not ever allowing them to take more to have a second bite. So the idea was only to have one bite and then move on. And in that way, we don't have any problems with runoff. And you can see from in the first jug, we actually have soil runoff off that paddock. We don't want that. We want everything to be in the back jug, and we want very little in the front one. So, you know, these are things to be aware of, even if you're ranching. All right. So healthy soils, like I said, are alive. They've got roots in them. They've got fungi. They've got lots of microarthropods, because nothing breaks down if we don't have microarthropods. And we have earthworms, which are sort of the high end of the ecosystem engineers. They're the ones that make tunnels. They burrow plant material from the surface and drag it down. They actually mix the soil, the topsoil and the subsoil. And they're very sensitive to tillage. That is the one thing. They really don't like their habitats being disturbed. Healthy soil is a habitat, and that's the first thing. So on our journey now, as we are making this transition to healthy soil for the long term, we need to think of our soil as a habitat. And a habitat is, so a healthy soil habitat is really characterized by water stable aggregates. So that's your slaking test, and a continuous soil pore network. Because how does everything move around if they can't move through this infrastructure like you see on the, well, you're looking at this, so it will be on your top left. Yeah, they have to move around between the pores. All the small animals like protozoa, nematodes, and bacteria, none of them can burrow. So they rely on good soil structure that's created mostly from plant root exudates to move around and have access to prey. So we need the protozoa to have access into the bacteria so they can feed on them, so they can control their populations, and also so they can concentrate things in and around the roots. And I am not going to talk a whole lot about the different parts of the soil biology and what really all the animals and the bacteria and everything that are part of having a healthy soil. We're just going to talk in sort of a stratosphere kind of view. So once you create the habitat, so to create the habitat, first things first, you have to minimize the soil disturbance, and there's just really no way around that. You have to eliminate the use of anhydrous ammonia. There's just, I've seen that for myself. We did trials in Washington, and where we used solution 32, and then we also ran anhydrous, and we ran, you know, multiple real replicates of that in blocks. And within 3 years, we still had the same amount of earthworm activity, which wasn't very much. We still had the same poor soil structure, but where we had switched to using solution 32 and we switched to some other things, we had way more soil activity, and our soils were far better structured. So I'm pretty sure that this is something that we should be doing. And I do realize that anhydrous ammonia is cheap. I do. But the other thing is that some of them are better bang for your buck. You get more from it. You can use less, and sometimes less is more. We need to reduce soil compaction. That doesn't necessarily mean going control traffic, although going control traffic can work very well. But just trying our best to reduce compaction. Maybe not haying a field every year, maybe not haying our cover crops or our stubbles all the time, and creating those increased erosion events, increased compaction events. And if we are going to create some compaction, then to actually try and use plants in the off season in order to reduce that. deep roots, big deep roots. Yeah, all of that can help with erosion. And always have roots in the soil, because that's the other thing. If there's roots in the soil, then we're building organic matter content in our soils. And if we're building organic matter content in our soils, then it's much harder to have compaction issues. Soils that have very little organic matter tend to be very compactable. So we want to build the organic matter. We want to have roots in our soil. And think about that. We often focus on, oh yeah, I've got all this residue. Look at all the carbon I have. No, the carbon that's in the soil are the root exudates and the roots. They're what's in the soil. And the soil microorganisms. They're what is creating the soil organic matter, not the stuff on the top. Stuff on the top barely contributes to any of our net soil carbon budget. So let your soil work and build and rebuild the infrastructure. Because once we have a really stable infrastructure, then we can start really working on our system. I put this in, this comes from DSV seed. Soil compaction is primarily a problem for germinating plants or seedlings, as it shows here. And we don't want we don't want our seedlings to spend a lot of energy trying to push roots. We do want some secondary roots, but secondary roots are always take a lot more energy. So the plant will produce secondary roots, or the lateral roots will produce lateral roots after it really gets to where it wants to be from a nutrient perspective. And then it will put more resources into lateral roots. If it's stuck, then you can see from the middle one, with even light compaction, it will start to put energy into lateral roots to see if it can pull more resources, because it can't go down, so it must pull resources from the side. And then you can see with even moderate compaction, the plant just is putting out a whole bunch of roots, trying to find some way down. And part of that's for water too. The last thing we want to do is deplete the resources of our seedlings. They can last by themselves for a good seed, and I say good seed, can germinate and last for about 10 to 12 days on its own. But after that, it needs help. And so if we want a strong crop, then we have to make sure that we have strong seedlings, and we have to give our germinating plants their best opportunity to establish. So let's think about phase one then, as we go forward. So in the first 0 to 5 years, right, of our transition, we want to start with stable soil. So you're creating the habitat. You've got no-till in place, or you're doing reduced tillage. And you're creating the habitat. Now, you can see when we have slightly compacted soils, we don't have as many roots. And we have roots that are just exploring all these poorly structured soils. But when we have well-structured soils with a really good crumb structure, it's easy to put the resources into producing lateral roots because there's more nutrients to find. It's easy to move. I'm not putting a lot of effort, energy into creating more cells so that I can push. And so, as you can see, when the plant isn't stressed and the plant isn't working too hard, when it can get all the resources it wants, it grows really well. And that's what we want. We don't necessarily want luxurious amounts of nutrients because that causes some other issues, but we do want the plant to work a little bit. We just don't want it to work super hard. And this is a very nice, on your right, this is a very nice little test using recycling water bottles to show well-structured soil. And you can see with the clear water, we have well-structured soil. And so it's an easy way to look at the differences between some of your fields. Do I really have well-structured soil? Pretty easy. Some water, 2 water bottles, and off you go. Creating soil structure is a dynamic process, and it is a dynamic process once you've reduced soil disturbance. And then it becomes about growing roots. It becomes about diversity. It becomes about crop rotation, because just because you build a habitat using, reducing the amount of disturbance, you still have this whole plant community that you need to be working on in order to really get your soils up and moving and working for you. And plant roots have the ability to affect soil structure themselves, and they do. And some plants like peas prefer to have really fine textured soils, and you can smell that. And you can smell it with beans too. You can smell soil, the tilth is very different from a corn plant or any kind of grass crop. And certainly you see the difference between your mixes. If you're growing cover crops, you'll see the differences. Some of them are tighter, others broken up and a whole lot looser. Once again, this is about planting with purpose. We can actually use plant roots, we can use our crop rotations to actually make soil properties and create this dynamic process the way we want it. So for example, canola is not very mycorrhizal, that's fine. Canola really stimulates soil animals. So I need to break down all those residues. I want to make my soil really light and flat. Canola can actually help you do that. Peas are the same because they're rich in protein. They also drive a lot, they sort of balance because they're mycorrhizal, they have good microbial activity, but they also stimulate all the soil animals because once again, they have a lot of protein in the residue. So you can see how these things are all connected and they're all starting to work together. So this is mustard in a forage cover crop, so mixed species. And then you have mustard as a monocrop. And you can see the differences in the soil structure. Every different plant you put in the ground leaks its own unique signature of carbon. And that carbon, root exudates, is what really drives the whole carbon cycle in your soil. It drives the microbial community too, because not everybody prefers the same kinds of food. So if you think about that from a microbial community standpoint, some of them like some of the more amino acids than they like sugars. Some of them like more sugars, some of them like more organic acids, and some of them like some lipids thrown in there. And all of them are going to modify the habitat, which is that area around the root, to their own liking, which will allow their friends to come in and probably prevent some of the bacteria or the animals that they don't like from coming in. Some of them may be pathogens, or some of them might be just, I don't like you. But the point is, in the end, that we can actually drive soil structure ourselves by growing roots, and we can drive the soil cycle. So once again, build the habitat, start adding plants, start adding diversity, and start making your system more resilient. Now, we can also use soil organic carbon pellets, in this case, for feeding the soil. So when you go here, you can see that we have eroded knolls, and there's just nothing that you could do. Like nothing was growing plants. Like there wasn't any mix. I mean, even multi-species mixes were just not growing on there very well because there just really wasn't, we're at subsoil. And then when we added pelleted compost, so we increased the soil organic matter and the water holding capacity and the nutrient holding capacity in the furrow, and then we seeded, we started to reclaim the eroded knolls. So evaluate the products and always do test strips, and always test it against your normal practice to see and make a comparison, because it's the only way you can really evaluate if a particular product is going to work in your system. Integrated livestock, that's the beauty of regenerative agriculture. And regenerative agriculture, at least I think, was built on integrated livestock grazing, or built around integrated livestock grazing, because all of a sudden my cover crops, my companions after I harvested my main crop, became fodder for my animals. and which meant that I had another enterprise. And I was increasing diversity on the farm, not only plant diversity, but also animal diversity. So that was our 0 to 5 year. Now we're at the 6 to 10 years. So we've made it through the first transition. We have a habitat, started playing with diversity, crop rotation, thinking about all the other things we're going to do. Our soils are starting to build on themselves. They're starting to recycle. We're seeing more organic matter build up. We're definitely seeing our soils start to work. Now, within that first 5 years, you can have setbacks. And because everything isn't stable yet, there's still a transition happening. So it doesn't take much to take a step back or take a step sideways. And you need to be aware of that. And those first 5 years are not the time when you drop back to no fertility. You can't do it, because if you do, then as you build that whole population of organisms in your soil, well, they need resources. And as you're building them, yeah, they're like, well, I'm going to use those resources up. And that means that the plants can't compete for the resources. And so sometimes getting around year 3, 4, and 5, we can have real problems. And the other thing, which I didn't mention earlier, was that the easiest way to start into making your transition is from a pasture or a cover. It's just easier because you sort of jump start that whole biological step, because you have the diversity, you have lack of disturbance, and so then you take the first step pretty easily. But now that you're through that, you get to the 6 to 9 year mark, and I broke them into these groups. You definitely you're going to see more surface residues. You'll certainly have better soil structure. You can do a slaking test. You can do infiltration. You can even get your soil aggregates looked at. Soil organic matter is accumulating. You should see improved cation exchange capacity, and definitely see more water holding capacity in your soil. So once again, we are climate proofing our soils. There'll be more biological activity. You should be able to dig in and see earthworms, and you should see more earthworms than you did at least the first 2 years that you were working on this. Phosphorus will be accumulating, and you will be recycling nutrients. You won't always see this in a soil test, but you will see it in how the plants are thriving and the health of the plants. And this is where tissue tests are going to be really valuable for you to see what's happening and how your plants are responding to this change in soils. Now, as you build organic matter and whatnot, you actually change the temperature of soil. So once your soils start becoming more organic, they actually increase in temperature, especially early in the spring, because they're working. Respiration. There's work going on in your soils. There's earthworms, there's all these bacteria and fungi and protozoa zooming around in there, and they are creating heat. And actually plants themselves actually create a lot of latent heat. But the most important thing is that really we want to be maintaining soil temperature in that somewhere between 15 and 25 degrees. We want to be maintaining the temperature in there because that's where things are all working really hard and they're working at their optimum. If we get any lower and we get any higher, things aren't working optimally. And that's why the surface residues are not that important for carbon. They are really important as insulation. And I just not to get away from grazing, we also see that oversowing of our pastures is also important for the quality of soil structure. So this is adding plants in there. And in this case, you can see it sort of worked out. This was the first time at oversowing. So there were strips of cover crops in the field or oversowing in the field. So it's really easy to go from 100% ryegrass to this mix. And you can see the differences in soil structure. Once again, soil diversity, plant diversity, creating better soil structure, more stable soil structure, which is allowing actually for better rooting, better aeration, better water holding, all those things, which is again making our soils more resilient. Surface residues insulate the soil. So I can see these slides were a little bit out of order here, but surface residues insulate the roots and soils from temperature, and that's so that everybody can work more efficiently. This does speed up the biogeochemical cycle. It reduces evaporation, which we all really want. It keeps your soil cool. And if your soils are cool, that means the roots are cool. And if the roots are cool, that means there's more water and oxygen in there. And if that's the case, then we're pumping more calcium and boron and more of those things that actually respond to transpiration up through the steel. So, you know, there's nothing, okay, it can delay you in the spring, but generally speaking, having insulation on your soil is a really good thing. And diversity, once again, is the key. Plants have greater biochemical diversity. So like I said, every different plant you put in the ground has its own unique signature. And plants produce a whole raft of chemicals that are very different from us, from animals. And so there's a lot more diversity of them. Plants are constantly altering their chemical structures of compounds to fight diseases, pests, or just to have them on hand in case there's a problem. And they'll also do it with light, changes in light quality, which will happen over the season or as the canopy comes in. With monoculture farming, we definitely have plants where we actually have a system where we're really set up to fail. Because we've frozen plant genetics. And so sometimes mixing like wheat varieties together will give you a little bit more stability and certainly allow for that diversity even within one species. And I'll show you a bit later on that also can change the quality of the crop itself. We can also intercrop, we can companion crop, mixed varieties. All of these things are important to creating stability in the system, creating resilience in the system. This is a case of intercropping pigeon peas. There was a whole series of trials with about 6 or 7 different legumes. But this is about like pigeon peas actually sharing the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the zinc with the plant that they're growing with. And they're also promoting all these plant growth promoting rhizoorganisms. So the rhizosphere of both the plants is altered because they're growing together and they're touching each other. So they're sharing. So they're sharing microbial communities, they're sharing resources, they're sharing water, all of these things. And so this is actual like dynamic feeding of the plant, of your crop plant at the same time. This can be a win-win situation as long as your companion is not competing with your cash crop. And that can take some trial and error. I'm not going to kid you about that. Now we go from 11 to 20 and we do a big jump here because really this is about just renovating, like you're tweaking. It gets to be more about tweaking. And soils do have a carrying capacity. You have innate soil properties. You can change them over time. I mean, David Brandt changed from having, clay pot soil to having, more humus and higher organic matter soils, and actually changed his soil type over time. So it's not that it can't happen. But even that has a carrying capacity. And you can improve that over time, but it's never going to grow in rapid leaps and bounds. you're seeing greater soil organic matter. You're getting carbon accumulating. You should have even more residue. So now you're really insulating. Certainly have higher water availability. And you're getting to the point where if Jimmy Emmons asks you, well, how much water did you get? You can say all of it. Nitrogen mineralization is greater than an immobilization, which is what I was talking about earlier, where you have hit a predator-prey balance where your microorganisms population is not so great, where it's eating up all the nutrients like the nitrogen and all the trace elements and starving the plant. You've reached an equilibrium where both of you, the plant and the soils and the soil organisms, are all working together. You definitely have an increased cation exchange capacity. And depending whether you've been growing more dicots or you've been growing more monocot plants, so grasses versus broadleaves, you'll also change that CEC a little bit. And you have active biologically mediated nutrient cycling or biological fertility. So now this is where you get to the point, and maybe a bit sooner, depending on whether you have integrated livestock grazing, whether you're using cover crops, whether you have forages in there. It all depends on your system. Some systems will go a lot faster. Some systems will go slower. It depends on your tolerance, your risk tolerance. It depends on what you're comfortable with. It depends on what you want out of your own system. So you'll either go really fast or you'll go a bit slower, or you go somewhere in between. But either way, when you focus on soil health and you focus on soil health building practices, you are going to move forward in that direction. Relay, and now you get to play. I mean, once you hit the 10-year mark, let's play. You have the ability to do some relay cropping. You should be thinking outside the box now. Like, what else can I do? I can use buckwheat that mines magnesium, phosphorus, and calcium. And so my soybeans take that up, and I get all the pollinators from the buckwheat. I get the advantage of having magnesium, phosphorus, and calcium put into the next crop. All these things. So now I'm understanding the synergies. I'm starting to understand synergies. I'm starting to understand how the nutrients all work together. And so in the end, and underpinning all of this again, is an awareness of rhizosphere dynamics, because all of what I've described are rhizosphere dynamics. It's all happening in the rooting zone. The rooting zone is the most biologically active part of your entire soil. That's why when we grow companion crops, we build a rooting zone in between the rows as well. This is all, so now we're improving the soil, not just improving half the soil, we're improving all of the soil. So you do need to have some idea about rhizosphere dynamics as we, because they are really they are driving your soil health. No way around it. And in fact, the rhizosphere, of course, can't exist without the plant roots. So you don't have plant roots, you don't have a rhizosphere. You don't have plant roots, you don't have a carbon cycle. So you need to have the plants, and they all work together. And this is a perfect example of Gaia working together for our benefit. And the rhizosphere, like I said, is the most biologically active part of your soil. You can see that in this banana root. See all the secondary roots, and you can see this huge rhizosheath where everything is built in there. All the mycorrhizas, all the fungi, everything is binding that soil to the root. And, roots are really the masters of carbon trading, and mycorrhizas are the original carbon trader. The soil carbon from the roots, like I said earlier, is the most important part. It's what really drives the carbon dynamics of our soil. And this is what goes on in the rhizosphere. We've got root exudates. We've got symbiosis going both ways. We've got nutrients going in and out. We've got water going in and out. We've got plant growth promoting substances coming from the microbial community. And we've got growth inhibiting substances coming from the pathogens. And all of this is affecting the plant. And the plant is dynamic in how it deals with all this. It's going to, as a seedling, it's going to be trying to create a rhizosphere that is growth promoting. It's going to have the symbionts that it really wants. And we're going to create the environment as farmers where the plant isn't going to have to leak nutrients into the soil. Our soils aren't going to be so salty that the plant's going to have to, the seed's going to have to lose water into the soil in order to balance the salts. Or the seed is going to, and we're going to use good seed. So that seed has everything it needs and doesn't need to give up something so it can pull something from the soil. We don't want any of that. And we want it to attract the right symbionts. We want this synergistic effect. Mycorrhiza, and I have talked about mycorrhiza before. This is an example of mycorrhiza, and you can see mycorrhiza actually live inside the plant root itself. They don't grow without a host, and that's like most endophytes. They don't grow without a host. They are working with the host. They're providing something for the host, and the host is providing something for them. And in this case, the plant host is providing photosynthates, which are amino acids, carbohydrates, organic acids, and lipids, and other secondary plant metabolites. And the mycorrhiza are providing water, hard to get mineral nutrients, and they will be they actually change the way the plant translocates photosynthate to the roots, and the roots become more of a sink. And in that case, we actually grow a bigger rhizosphere. We grow a bigger microbial community because the mycorrhiza are actually pulling more photosynthate from the plant itself. But because they're providing more water and more nutrients, the plant maintains its growth rate. Mycorrhiza fungi, well, yeah, they're the original carbon trader, as I said, but they have, with their highly effective network, they also stabilize the soil with glomalin, and also just their hyphae that act like nets, and they bind all the soil particles together, and they bind them in and around the roots. So they're creating a beautiful environment around the roots, like this. And you can see so much more activity. And look at how hard a pathogen is going to have to work to get in through the mycorrhizosphere, as opposed to on the other side where there's no mycorrhizosphere, pathogen doesn't have to work very hard to get at the root, and neither does a nematode. So there are advantages to having a really strong rhizosphere and a really strong mycorrhizosphere. One size fits no one. There's no recipe for what I just talked about that will work for all of you. They're only, the process that you go through. How you go through that process is up to you. What plants you use in your cover crops, whether you use intercrops, whether you use companion crops, these are all uniquely yours. Your soils are uniquely yours. The equipment that you have, the equipment that you have access to, the technology you have access to is uniquely yours. There's a suite of proven practices and strategies that you adapt to your own farm or ranch. High density stock grazing. Well, some people can make really small paddocks. I mean, Neil Dennis was a master at it. Others, like me, are using like 100-acre, 50-acre pastures in my grassland, and smaller paddocks on the forages, but without the same resources to move them every day. So I'm moving every 2 or 3 days, so I have bigger paddocks because I want my cows to move without going back and taking a second bite. It's going to take time, and it's going to take patience, and it's going to take flexibility. You're going to have to be prepared to pivot. Some things are going to work, some things aren't. And I know I got a growing season. Sometimes we can pivot in the middle of a growing season. Sometimes we don't have a choice. And you will have to pick your own path. There's no way around it. You pick your own path. I was reminding you all of our model and how everything is connected. And that includes nutrient density in our food. When we have healthy soils, I think intuitively we all understand that we have more mineral nutrients and we have more nutrient dense food. And there's definitely some organizations that are working to prove that. This is an experiment I did with Bob Quinn, where we grew, well, we were really looking at new varieties and old varieties of wheat, and trying to compare. Dr. Ishmael Çakmak in Turkey has done a lot of this work on Aegean wheats and looked at, what was driving zinc uptake and whatnot. And so we looked at the old varieties and the new varieties, and every variety differed, for the most part. And one of the things we talked about was, well, what if we mix varieties, as long as they mature at a roughly the same time, and then we could have a full nutrient profile. So we could balance out. So for example, a wheat that was low in calcium, like Tiber, but is sort of higher in zinc, we could grow, a higher Cheyenne, which is high in calcium, with a Tiber, and then actually grow them together and actually have a really balanced nutrient profile. The take home: open your mind to change. The biggest barrier to change is you. Seek and evaluate new ideas. Not all of them are crazy, and maybe some of the ones you think are crazy, if you actually took the time to not dismiss them, might not be as crazy as you actually thought. Seek community. So in other words, find a peer group. Find people who are of a like mind of you and start working together, start talking together, start sharing ideas and working on them together. And there's been a lot of talk about that right now, of how important community is to our well-being, as well as our productivity. Focus on soil health and remember, all your actions are connected. Build the habitat and then keep going. Don't just stop with no-till, because that's not going to work. You need to play with crop rotation. You need to play with cover crops and companion crops, and you need to really evaluate what crops you can grow and what the rotation can be, and what things you can grow in the middle in order to keep your system really working. You want to be aware of that rhizosphere dynamics can create powerful beneficial changes. And sometimes you think, oh, that doesn't make economic sense, but does it? Maybe I don't have to spend fossil fuel to go through and do a tillage operation. Maybe I don't have to use my time to get onto a piece of equipment. I can just go and seed it once and walk away and have a vacation. If that were only true, right? And lastly, when you're standing on your ground, you're really standing on the rooftop of another world. And that's your soil health. And that is the foundation of agriculture. It's the foundation of regenerative agriculture. It's the foundation of your agroecosystem. It's the foundation of the water cycle and the atmosphere and everything. So learn from yesterday, live for today, and change tomorrow. 3 generations of farmers out in the grazing field looking at earthworms with the next generation. And let's grow and learn and innovate together. We have an online community, Global Food and Farm, and it's an international community. There are people from all over the world in the community, and we share our experiences, and we share our problems, and we share our successes, and everybody's open. Ask questions. Yeah, you never know. Sometimes some of our African friends know more about certain things than we do. And sometimes it's the reverse. And sometimes the people from down under. And you're going to get a slightly different perspective, but sometimes that really helps to guide you and push you and propel you forward. I hope that this will help you future-proof your farm and your business, and certainly propel you on your journey to have better soil health. Thank you very much.
There we go, folks. Hey, a big round of applause for Jill Clapperton.